The fluorescent lights above Trauma Bay 3 hummed their electric prayer as Megan O'Brien's fingers found the vein with the kind of precision that made younger nurses stop and watch. She didn't rush. The 4-line slid home, a 20-gauge angiocath, smooth as silk through the elderly patient's papery skin, and she secured the dressing with tape that curved like a surgeon's signature. The saline drip began its metronome click-click-click into the line, steady and clean. She was already moving to the next task when Dr. Mercer's voice cut across the trauma bay like a scalpel through silk. Note the procedural shortcuts masquerading as efficiency. His Italian shoes, expensive ones, the kind that squeaked when he walked, clicked closer to her station. A dozen residents and medical students pivoted toward him like sunflowers. Mercer gestured toward Megan with the casual dismissal of a man accustomed to an audience. Diploma mill nursing schools produce this sort of workaround mentality. She skips half the standard insertion protocol. No wonder we see line infections spike on her shifts. Megan didn't pause her charting. Her pen moved across the patient's intake form with the same mechanical steadiness her hands had used on the 4. Click, click, click. The sound of the saline drip. The sound of Mercer's voice. The sound of 7 residents scribbling notes about the nameless nurse who cut corners. She was already invisible to them, easier to dismiss than to truly see. Look at her technique, Mercer continued, gesturing at the 4 site. That's not the Seldinger method. That's the kind of shortcut you see at rural clinics, not a trauma center. He turned to the attending physician. I'm recommending we audit her certifications. There's a pattern here. His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes, the smile of a man who'd built a career on knowing exactly which doors to open and which to lock. The residents scattered like startled birds when grand rounds moved on, but Megan felt the weight of suspicion settle on her shoulders like a lead apron. She finished her charting. She didn't look up. She didn't let her jaw clench more than a millimeter. The patient's oxygen saturation was stable at 98%. The 4 was patent. The line would hold. It was clean work, and clean work didn't need defending. The break room smelled like old coffee and broken dreams at 3 in the afternoon. Megan was reaching for the vending machine, black coffee, no sugar, the only thing that never disappointed, when Mercer appeared in the doorway with that same practiced casualness. His presence made the air pressure change. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim when he entered a room, as if they were surrendering rather than illuminating. Fascinating resume you submitted when you applied here, he said. He wasn't asking. He was performing, even with no audience but her. Your previous employer in Tacoma, what was the name? I've been trying to verify some details. He opened a file folder with deliberate slowness. There seemed to be gaps. Employment gaps that don't quite add up. References that are difficult to reach. Megan inserted a dollar bill into the machine. The mechanical whir and clunk of the can dropping was the loudest sound in the room. She didn't turn around. She didn't defend herself. She didn't say that some doors don't open, that some lives can't be explained in a resume, that classified simply meant classified. I'm beginning to wonder if those transcripts are genuine, Mercer continued. His voice had the texture of a man sharpening a knife. You know, we have standards here. Credentials matter. Experience matters. The hospital has a reputation to protect. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. If you're practicing above your certification level, we need to address that immediately. Megan opened the can of coffee. The tab released with a metallic snap that sounded like a hammer strike in the sudden quiet. She turned to face him then, just a half turn, controlled, with the kind of stillness that came from years of standing in rooms where one wrong movement meant someone died. Her dark eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds. Not challenging. Not submissive. Present. Available. Waiting. Then she returned to her coffee. I've been making calls, Mercer said to her back. To previous employers, to the nursing board. There are inconsistencies. I will find out what you're hiding. He walked out, his expensive shoes clicking away down the corridor, and Megan stood alone in the break room with her coffee that had gone cold in her hands. The next morning brought a combat medic into Trauma Bay 2 for a routine procedure. He came in with his arm wrapped, recovering from a training accident at Fort Bragg, a dislocated shoulder that needed monitoring, nothing dramatic, the kind of injury soldiers collected like other people collected frequent flyer miles. He was young, maybe 23, with the posture of someone still learning that his body could betray him. Megan was performing a routine chest tube insertion when his eyes went wide. Not from pain, the local anesthetic had already taken hold, but from recognition. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist mid-procedure, stopping her movement with the certainty of someone who understood anatomy the way poets understand language. "Who taught you to do it like that?" His voice dropped to barely a whisper, and his grip on her wrist was respectful, not aggressive. A question, not a threat. Megan didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady as a surgical laser, the needle positioned at the fifth intercostal space, mid-axillary line. She looked at the young medic's face and saw recognition blooming there like blood in water. He'd seen that three-point anchor technique before. He'd probably used it himself in the back of Hums under mortar fire. He'd probably held his buddy's chest open with his hands while explosions walked across the compound like angry gods. "Just training," she said. Her voice didn't change. It never changed. 10 words or fewer. That was the rule she'd given herself the day she'd walked into Seattle General with a resume that couldn't explain the decade of her life that mattered most. The medic studied her for another moment, then slowly released his grip. "That's not civilian training," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, the way you'd confirm a diagnosis after seeing the X-ray. That's field medicine. That's keeping people alive when the hospital is 6 hours away and the next mortar lands in 3 minutes. Megan continued the procedure. The needle advanced into the thoracic cavity with the smooth precision of muscle memory, years of repetition, hundreds of insertions, 10 of them in the kind of situations that civilians trained for in simulations but never actually experienced. The tube seated. The dressing went on. The job was done, clean and correct. "I won't say anything," the medic said as she was finishing. "But whoever you were before this, whoever did that training, they did good work." Megan labeled the drainage collection container and made a note in the chart. When she looked at him again, her expression was neutral in the way that only people who'd learned to hide in plain sight could manage. "The procedure is complete. You'll need follow-up imaging in 48 hours. The resident will give you the appointment schedule." She walked out before he could ask another question, before she could see the moment when he realized he'd just met someone who'd somehow survived being buried and then resurfaced wearing scrubs instead of body armor. The supply closet was where she went when the trembling started. Not in front of the medic. Not in front of the residents. Not in front of Mercer. She waited until she was alone, surrounded by boxes of gauze and 4 bags stacked like a fortress that no one would think to breach. Her hands pressed against the cool metal shelving. Her breathing came in measured counts, 4 counts in, hold for 4, release for 4, the way they'd taught her when she was learning to handle the sound of helicopters landing and the knowledge that whatever was waiting under those rotors was probably catastrophic. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the careful management of someone who'd learned that losing control killed people. It was the physical sensation of holding back something so much larger than the room around her, something so much more dangerous than Dr. Mercer and his insinuations and his investigations into employment gaps she could never fill in. Scars tell stories. The rope-scarred tissue on her forearms told the story of carrying wounded through burning rooms. The way her hands moved without hesitation told the story of 2 decades of muscle memory that couldn't be unlearned. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, black and gold Special Forces insignia, told the story of brothers and sisters who'd never come home, and of one woman who'd walked away carrying the weight of all the ones she couldn't save. In the supply closet, with her hands pressed against the metal shelving and the fluorescent lights humming their patient song above her, Megan O'Brien allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to remember that she was more than a nurse, more than a ghost moving through Seattle General's trauma bays, more than the target of a man trying to prove she didn't belong. And then she straightened her scrubs, touched the unit patch through the fabric of her jacket lining, and walk back out to the hospital floor where her hands were steady and her voice was deferential and her eyes gave nothing away. But that wasn't the worst part. The other nurses stopped making eye contact around the same time Dr. Mercer started his campaign in earnest. Megan noticed it during grand rounds, the way they'd suddenly find urgent tasks at the opposite end of the hallway when she approached, the way conversations died mid-sentence when she entered the break room. It was a calculated social crucifixion, and Mercer orchestrated it with the precision of someone who'd spent decades weaponizing institutional hierarchy. It started with the residents. 12 of them circled bed 7 during teaching rounds, their tablets and notebooks ready, their faces arranged in that particular expression of medical superiority that came from having letters after their names and minimal actual responsibility. Megan was adjusting a central line, a routine procedure she'd performed 1,700 times, maybe more, though she'd stopped counting somewhere around Damascus when Mercer arrived with his entourage. He didn't start with her. He started with the patient, a woman with sepsis who needed the line adjusted because the catheter had drifted 2 millimeters off course. Megan could see it in the pressure reading, the subtle shift in the waveform that told her the line had migrated. The residents couldn't. They were still trying to remember which artery was anterior and which was posterior. "Observe," Mercer said, his voice carrying the particular timbre of a man accustomed to being listened to. He gestured at her with his tablet like she was a cadaver in an anatomy lab. "Note the workaround. This is what happens when diploma mill nurses develop shortcuts instead of proper technique. Miss O'Brien here represents the procedural drift that kills patients." 20 pairs of eyes settled on her hands. Medical students, residents, 2 attending physicians, a physician's assistant. All watching. All absorbing his narrative like it was gospel printed in the New England Journal of Medicine. Megan's jaw clenched once. Imperceptibly. Then released. Her hands continued their work. She adjusted the line with textbook precision, every movement deliberate, every angle correct, every suture placed exactly as it should be. Her hands moved like those of someone who'd done this in the back of moving vehicles under gunfire, in field hospitals where the electricity ran on generators and the antibiotics came from supply caches meant for 300 soldiers, not 800. But she was in Seattle General now, in the sanitized corridors where competence was supposed to matter more than credentials, and apparently she'd been spectacularly wrong about that. She charted the vitals as though he hadn't spoken. As though his voice hadn't just wrapped around her like a noose in front of an audience of people she worked alongside every shift. The line was perfect now. Pressure reading stable. Waveform clean. She initialed the chart and moved to the next patient without looking up. The residents exchanged glances. Mercer smiled like a man who'd just taught them something important about hierarchy. 3 days later, the break room became another theater for his cruelty. Shift change meant 8 staff members gravitating toward the coffee station at once, the refrigerator, the vending machine that dispensed coffee that tasted like it had been recycled through a hospital gown. Megan was alone with the machine, hitting C7 for her usual black coffee, when Mercer materialized beside her like he'd been waiting. "I've been meaning to ask, O'Brien," he said, loud enough for the 8 people pretending not to listen. "Did your previous employers actually verify those credentials, or did they just take your word for it? Because I'm having trouble tracking down anyone at that Tacoma facility who remembers you." The machine hissed. The coffee cup fell into the slot with a plastic rattle. She selected the cup slowly, giving herself 3 seconds to arrange her expression into something neutral. The other nurses had stopped moving. One of them had her phone up, probably texting about the drama. Megan could feel their eyes on her the way animals can sense predators they can't see. "Credential verification is a human resources function," she said quietly, reaching for the cup. "Not something I handled personally." "Of course not," Mercer said, his voice smooth as surgical silk. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation. A phone number, maybe. A supervisor's name I could call. Something that would put this to rest." Her hand trembled once as she reached for the cup. Just once. A microsecond of visible weakness. She tucked the coffee against her side before anyone could notice, the warmth a small anchor against her ribs. "I'll provide contact information to HR," she said. "They can verify whatever they need to verify." She walked past him toward the door, past the other nurses who'd suddenly become very interested in their phones and their lunch containers and the ceiling tiles. The silence in the break room was the kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. Later that week, the medication room. Mercer had caught her there alone, pulling antibiotics for a patient with a bloodstream infection. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical song, and the room smelled like antiseptic and plastic, the smell of every hospital corridor she'd ever known, every place where life balanced on the edge of a drug interaction or an allergy she should have known about. "If you continue practicing above your certification level," Mercer said, not bothering with preamble, "I'll have security escort you out of this hospital. You're one procedure away from a malpractice suit I'll personally ensure destroys whatever's left of your fraudulent career." The threat hung in the air like contaminated air in a negative pressure room. She could report it. She could escalate it. She could do any number of things that would result in immediate, catastrophic retaliation. She nodded once. "I understand," she said quietly. She returned to preparing her patient's antibiotics with steady hands while her heart performed arrhythmias that would have alarmed any cardiologist. 10 minutes later, in the supply closet behind the patient documentation station, she pressed her forehead against the cool metal shelving and breathed through her nose until her hand stopped shaking. The smell of sterile gauze packages and saline bags surrounded her like armor. She touched the faded unit patch through the fabric of her jacket lining, the patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment, small enough to hide, significant enough to anchor her to something true. Then she straightened her scrubs, arranged her face into something professional, and walked back out to the hospital floor where her hands were steady and her voice was deferential and her eyes gave nothing away. But the damage was spreading. Mercer's whispers had taken root in the staff like a fungal infection. Forged transcripts. Suspicious employment gaps. A background that didn't add up. None of it was true, but truth was irrelevant in the economy of institutional gossip. 3 nurses who used to eat lunch with her now took their breaks in different rooms. The pharmacist who'd once joked with her about medication side effects now offered minimal eye contact when she placed orders. The respiratory therapist had started asking for verification on routine procedures Megan had been performing for years. It was brilliant, actually. Cruel, but brilliant. Mercer wasn't building a case against her, not yet. He was building a narrative. By the time he needed documentation, he'd already poisoned the well so thoroughly that no one would believe her version of events. And more importantly, no one would be willing to defend her. The routine admissions continued. The paperwork piled up. The hours blurred together the way they always did in nursing, that particular exhaustion that came from caring about people while carrying the weight of professional survival. She charted carefully. She documented everything. She performed her procedures with the same precision she'd learned in a place she couldn't acknowledge, with people she couldn't name, under conditions that had taught her more about human anatomy and human will than any textbook ever could. And then the major from Special Forces checked into Seattle General for a routine post-deployment physical, and everything became a waiting game with a timer nobody had set yet. He'd served in Ramadi during the worst of the insurgency, he mentioned to Dr. Mercer during the consultation appointment. Mercer had seized on this like a shark detecting blood in water. Here was an officer, a decorated soldier, someone whose respect he could cultivate while simultaneously undermining a rival. He spent 20 minutes discussing his own research publications, his academic credentials, the importance of rigorous medical training. All things that didn't address the fact that the major's vitals showed increasing respiratory distress. The patient's oxygen saturation was hovering around 92%. His respiratory rate had crept up to 22 breaths per minute. His blood pressure was elevated, 148/94. Megan, the patient's unit nurse during the consultation, had flagged it twice. Mercer had dismissed it as anxiety and prescribed a sedative. The major was admitted for overnight observation on her unit. This was the moment. This was when everything changed, though Megan didn't know it yet. All she knew was that there was a patient who needed monitoring, a unit patch that had once belonged to a unit she'd served in, and a doctor whose contempt for her had become a living thing that moved through the hospital like a virus. She prepared the patient's room with a precision that came from muscle memory, from years of doing this exact task in contexts that ranged from routine to catastrophic. Fresh linens. Pulse oximeter. Cardiac monitor leads. For access already in place from the ER. The Major settled into the bed with the particular exhaustion of someone whose body had been pushed past what civilian medicine considered reasonable, and Megan checked his vitals with a practiced efficiency that made him study her for a moment too long. "You move like someone who's been in the field," he said quietly. "I just pay attention to detail," she replied, refusing to meet his eyes. But something had shifted. Something in the way he was watching her, the way his eyes tracked the scar tissue on her forearms that she'd stopped bothering to hide with long sleeves. Something that suggested he recognized something in her that she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it was there. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The IV dripped its clear fluids. The hospital moved forward into the night, and Megan O'Brien, or whoever she'd been before, whoever she was now, prepared for something she didn't yet understand was coming. The monitor started screaming at 2:47 in the morning. Megan heard it from the med room 3 doors down, that particular high-pitched wail that meant oxygen saturation had crossed below 70. She was already moving before the second alarm joined in, the kind of reflex that didn't require thought. The ICU at Seattle General had the bone-tired quiet of deep night, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical drone, and that sound cut through it like a knife through still water. The Major's bed was third from the nurse's station. She reached it in 4 strides, her eyes cataloguing the crisis in milliseconds. His lips were already blue. Not pale. Blue. The kind of blue that meant his blood was hungry for oxygen and not getting it. His heart rate was hammering at 140, climbing like a climber who'd run out of rope. The resident, some first year whose name she'd never bothered to learn, was standing at the bedside with his hands hovering uselessly over the crash cart like a conductor who'd forgotten the music. "Call Dr. Mercer," he stammered. "We need to." Megan didn't hear the rest. She was already keying the intercom, her voice dropping into that specific register that made people move without questioning. "Respiratory to ICU bed 3. Code Blue protocols. Now." The resident stepped back. Good. She didn't have time for frozen hands or frozen minds. The Major's eyes were rolling back in his head, his body doing the desperate work of a lung that had collapsed. She could see it in the way his chest moved, asymmetrical. Left side barely moving. Right side compensating. His trachea was deviated, pushed sideways like his own anatomy was being rearranged by invisible hands. The jugular veins in his neck stood out like cables, distended and angry. Tension pneumothorax. She'd seen it before. She'd treated it before. Not in a hospital. In the back of a Humvee rolling through Ramadi with incoming fire punching holes through the canvas roof. Her hand reached for the decompression kit and found it already in motion, performing the sequence without waiting for permission from her brain. The resident had organized it well enough. 14-gauge catheter. Alcohol prep. The exact spot she needed was between the second and third ribs, midclavicular line on his left side. The textbooks called it the second intercostal space. She'd always thought of it as the place between life and suffocation. She prepped the skin in 3 swift movements. No hesitation. No ceremony. The Major's skin was cold under her gloved hand, and she could feel the trapped pressure beneath, air where air shouldn't be, compressing his lung against his heart, suffocating him from the inside out. His monitor showed a heart rate of 145 now. Climbing. The oxygen saturation had dropped to 64. 62. 60. She didn't feel the needle go in. That wasn't how this worked. There was no moment where she decided to do it. Her hands had already decided in Ramadi, had already learned this rhythm in the dark with the sound of mortar fire making the whole vehicle shake. The decisive thrust between the ribs. The catheter sliding through skin, through fascia, through the pleural space into the pocket of pressurized air. The hiss when the air escaped was immediate and violent. It was the sound of pressure releasing, of physics winning the fight against death. That sharp, distinctive hiss of compressed air rushing out of a space where it had no business being. The Major gasped, a real, productive gasp, not the shallow, desperate thing he'd been doing before. His body convulsed slightly as oxygen finally found its way back to his blood, and his lips began to change color. Not blue anymore. Pink returning. Pink spreading. The monitor settled. 120. 115. His oxygen saturation climbed. 64. 70. 78. 82. Megan's hands were already moving to the next step, pulling the catheter back slightly, attaching the one-way valve that would let air escape but not re-enter. Her movements had the fluid precision of a pianist playing a piece she'd practiced 1,000 times. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The resident watched from the other side of the bed, finally understanding what he was actually seeing. By the time Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway, still buttoning his shirt with one hand while his eyes were adjusting to the ICU lighting, the crisis had already resolved itself into calm. The Major's monitor showed a stable rhythm. His oxygen saturation hovered at 88 and steady. Megan was already preparing for proper chest tube placement, her hands moving with the same focused competence that had kept 3 wounded Marines alive under mortar attack in a building that no longer had a roof. Dr. Mercer stopped in the doorway. 12 minutes. He'd taken 12 minutes to get from his bed to the hospital, and she'd used every second of those 12 minutes to do something he couldn't. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge him. She simply continued charting, her handwriting steady, her vital signs documentation precise. Time, procedure, patient response. Everything by the book. Everything that would hold up under scrutiny. But Mercer wasn't looking at the chart. He was looking at the spent decompression kit. At the Major's changed color. At the monitor showing stable vitals. At the resident's expression, which had shifted from panic to something like awe. His face went through 3 different expressions in approximately 2 seconds. Recognition first. Then calculation. Then something darker that looked like understanding. He stood there for maybe 5 seconds without moving. Then he turned and walked back into the hallway, pulling his phone from his pocket before the door had even swung shut. She heard his voice start low and controlled, the kind of controlled that meant he was careful about who might be listening. "It's me. We have a situation." A pause. Then, "No. Worse than that." Megan continued her documentation. The next word she heard would come later, after the sun rose, but they would come. The investigation. The phone calls. The slow, careful work of a man who'd spent decades building power and wasn't about to let it slip away. But that was a future problem. For now, there was only the present, a Major whose lungs were re-inflated, whose color was returning, whose heart was beating steady and strong in a body that had almost died while a first-year resident froze. She needed some jello. Or sleep. Probably both. But the night wasn't finished yet, and neither was she. The medication cart beeped softly as she moved it toward the next bed, her hand steady as surgical lasers, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the crisis that had just resolved. Somewhere down the hallway, Dr. Mercer was making calls that would change everything. But she didn't know that yet. She only knew what she'd always known, that when people froze, you moved. When systems failed, you improvised. When the choice came between walking away and standing up, you always stood up, and you made sure your hands were steady when you did. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song above her. The monitors continued their rhythmic beeping. The night air moved through the ICU vents with the faint smell of antiseptic and something deeper, the particular scent of a crisis that had narrowly avoided becoming a tragedy. And Megan O'Brien, who used to be Captain O'Brien, who might become something else entirely by the time this night was finished, simply continued her work like a woman who'd spent her entire life knowing that nobody was coming to save you. You saved yourself. You saved others. And you never, ever looked back. Dr. Mercer stood in the empty corridor at 4:53 a.m., his hands trembling as he punched the first number into his phone. He'd saved the hospital board chairman's personal line in his contacts 3 years ago, back when they'd bonded over scotch and resentment of nurses who thought they deserved input on medical decisions. The phone rang twice. "This better be good, Richard." The chairman's voice was thick with sleep. "I found something," Mercer said, his voice steady now, the tremor replaced with calculated precision. "A nurse here just performed an emergency procedure. Saved a VIP patient who came in under my care. The problem is her entire employment history is fabricated. I have documented inconsistencies, gaps she refuses to explain, references that don't verify." He paused, letting the implication hang. "We need to investigate before she becomes a liability." The chairman was awake now. "Send me everything you have." The second call went to HR at Providence Medical in Tacoma, a facility Mercer had researched meticulously, a large enough network that his inquiry might get lost in the shuffle. "I'm calling about a former employee," he told the director, his voice carrying the authority of a senior physician. "Megan O'Brien. Worked in your trauma nursing division approximately 4 years ago. I need to verify employment dates and certification status." There was a pause. A keyboard clicking. "I'm not finding anyone by that name in our system for that time period." "Perfect." Mercer smiled. "Thank you for confirming." The third call was to Vincent Cross, the private investigator he'd kept on retainer for exactly these moments when someone needed to disappear from the inside out. "I need background verification work," Mercer said quietly. "Employee named Megan O'Brien. Current staff at Seattle General. I need you to document employment gaps, verify reference checks, and flag any inconsistencies in her background." Cross had done this before. "How deep do you want me to go?" "Deep enough to make the board suspend her pending investigation," Mercer said. "But not so deep that it traces back to me." By noon, Megan sat in the executive conference room on the 4th floor of Seattle General, the kind of room with mahogany paneling and windows overlooking Puget Sound. 5 board members. Dr. Mercer standing at the head of the table like a prosecutor preparing his closing argument. A folder, thick, institutional, heavy with accusation, sat on the polished wood surface in front of her. The HR director cleared her throat. "Ms. O'Brien, thank you for meeting with us on short notice." Mercer didn't wait for pleasantries. He opened the folder and began sliding pages across the table like a blackjack dealer. "We've uncovered significant inconsistencies in your employment history," he started, his tone carrying the confidence of a man who'd already won. "The Tacoma facility you listed as previous employment, Providence Medical, has no record of you ever working there. Your references cannot be verified through normal channels. And there are documented gaps, 18 months unaccounted for, that you have, in every conversation, refused to explain." He ticked off each point on his fingers, each one landing like a hammer. The board director leaned forward, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Ms. O'Brien, these are serious discrepancies. Can you account for them?" Megan's hands were folded in her lap. Her face remained neutral, the composure of someone who'd held bleeding soldiers while explosions rattled the walls. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. "I cannot discuss certain previous employment," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, almost soft. "The employment gaps are classified." Mercer's thin smile never wavered. "Classified," he repeated, a note of theatrical disbelief in his voice. "How remarkably convenient." He produced a sheaf of documents. "I have phone logs from Providence Medical confirming they received verification requests about you and found no matching employment records. I have background check documentation showing security walls on this period you claim is classified. I have reference checks that came back blank." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of a man delivering a prosecution case. "What I have, board members, is evidence of either profound incompetence or deliberate fabrication." One of the board members, an older woman with silver hair, was shaking her head slowly. "The implications are serious," she said. "We have a responsibility to our patients." The board director's voice was careful now, measured. Ms. O'Brien, your refusal to provide explanation leaves us in a difficult position. This hospital cannot employ someone with unverifiable credentials, regardless of recent performance. Megan didn't move. Didn't speak. Mercer watched her face, searching for a crack, a tremor, some sign of the person he'd been methodically destroying. He found nothing. Her stillness was absolute. The board moves to suspend Ms. O'Brien pending a full investigation into her employment history and credentials, the director announced. This suspension is effective immediately. Security arrived at 3:15 p.m. A young officer who'd seen Megan in the hallways 100 times, who'd never known her name until now. He held out his hand for her badge, the laminated card with her photo and title, the credential that had opened every door. She unpinned it and handed it to him. Mercer watched from the nurse's station, the same corner where he'd loudly questioned her credentials during grand rounds, where he'd told the staff she was a prime example of shortcuts masquerading as efficiency. His thin smile was in place. She was leaving. He'd won. At 3 a.m. that night, in a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Norfolk, Megan sat in a booth with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with the same electric frequency as the ones at Seattle General. Outside, rain hammered the parking lot in sheets, the kind of rain that sounded like applause. Her reflection in the dark window was ghostly, translucent. She was looking at herself and seeing two versions, the woman in the reflection, and the woman who'd held a Marine's chest open with her hands while shrapnel tore through the walls around her. Ramadi, 2019. 3 soldiers bleeding out. Mortar rounds shaking the structure. Her hands had been steady then. Her mind had been surgical. She'd pulled wounded from rubble while rounds snapped past her head. She'd improvised tourniquets from paracord and performed triage with nothing but her training and the knowledge that people would die if she didn't move. That woman had saved 17 lives. This woman, sitting in a diner, watching the rain blur her reflection, was being erased by a man in a $3,000 suit who'd made it his personal mission to destroy her. The trucker at the counter had been watching her for the last 20 minutes. Old enough to have seen things. Military bearing in his posture, the way he sat, the way his eyes tracked movement. He recognized something in her stillness. Recognized it and looked away, because some silences are sacred. Megan wrapped her hands around the cold coffee cup and wondered if the woman who'd survived Ramadi, who'd survived that buried operation with classified designation and Pentagon security clearance, had somehow survived only to be erased twice, once by the government that had owned her service, and now by a hospital administrator with a grudge and a private investigator on retainer. The rain kept falling. Outside, somewhere in the city, Dr. Mercer was sleeping the sleep of the victorious. In 6 months, he would receive a notice that his investigation had been closed. In a year, he would be reading from the back of a medical supply van in Spokane, his license revoked, his career evaporated like the rain on the parking lot glass. But she didn't know that yet. She only knew the cold coffee in her hands and the weight of 18 months she couldn't explain and the silence of everyone she'd tried to save. The routine background check came back on a Tuesday morning. The kind of morning where nothing felt like it was about to end careers. Megan had submitted the paperwork 2 weeks earlier for her reinstatement hearing, standard procedure, bureaucratic formality that never raised flags. But this flag wasn't standard. The background check contractor ran her information through the federal database like they always did, and something woke up in the Pentagon's archives. Something classified. Something with her name attached to operation clearances and duty rosters that weren't supposed to surface outside secured channels. The system flagged it. Escalated it. Within 40 minutes, 2 Pentagon security officers in pressed uniforms were walking through Seattle General's administrative corridor with credentials that made every guard step aside without question. The conference room where Dr. Mercer was presenting his case to the hospital board fell silent when they entered. Mercer was mid-sentence, mid-gesture, holding up the folder thick with his fabricated evidence, his voice steady with the confidence of a man who'd orchestrated everything perfectly. His attorney sat beside him. The board chairman sat across the table, 3 other board members flanking him like a jury. And then the door opened and the air pressure in the room changed. The security officers didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. Their presence alone rewrote every assumption Mercer had built his case on. "We need to clarify some information," the senior officer said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, quiet, immense, capable of crushing everything in its path. That was when the door opened again. The major in dress uniform stood in the doorway, service ribbons arranged across his chest like a constellation of honors, and when his eyes found Megan's they held a recognition that made the board members straighten in their seats. He stepped forward with the kind of precision that comes from 23 years of movement under fire, and he looked directly at Dr. Mercer with the flat expression of someone assessing a tactical problem that had already been solved. "Valkyrie," the major said quietly. The call sign hung in the air like a weapon. "That's what we called her. That's what the men called her in Ramadi when she pulled 3 wounded soldiers from a collapsing building under active sniper fire." Mercer's face began to change color. His hand tightened on the folder. "Captain O'Brien," the major continued, his voice steady and lethal, "ran a combat surgical team under my direct command. She held a Marine's chest open with her own hands for 40 minutes while we took mortar rounds. 40 minutes. While rounds impacted meters away. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She kept him breathing until the dust was clear enough for the medical evacuation helicopter to land." Megan sat perfectly still. Her hands rested on the table in front of her, scarred, steady, the hands that had done impossible things in impossible places. The major unfolded a document, old paper bearing official seals, and read from the citation with the kind of authority that made the room forget how to breathe. During Operation Copper Dagger, Captain Megan O'Brien rendered medical aid to 17 service members under direct enemy fire, demonstrating extraordinary valor and exceptional tactical medical expertise that exceeded standard field protocols and saved lives that should have been lost to catastrophic trauma. Her actions represent the highest traditions of military medicine and personal courage under extreme duress. Dr. Mercer interrupted, voice rising. "This is clearly a coordinated fiction. I have documentation proving. What you have," one of the Pentagon security officers said, "is fraud. Let me walk you through what we found." The officer opened a tablet. Phone logs. Bank records. Spreadsheets of payment dates. You made 4 calls to Tacoma Regional Medical Center on March 18th. They have no record of those calls. You forged their letterhead on employment verification documents. You paid your investigator $8,000 for illegal database access to conduct background checks using federal credentials you don't possess. That's wire fraud. Identity fraud. Unauthorized access to federal systems. You also submitted falsified employment records to the hospital board under oath, which is perjury in front of witnesses. What would you like to start with? The silence that followed was so thick you could operate in it. Mercer's attorney was already leaning over, whispering urgently. Mercer's jaw worked without sound. The folder fell from his hands and scattered across the table, pages spilling like evidence, like confession, like the collapse of everything he'd built. The FBI agents arrived 17 minutes later with the warrant already signed. They walked past the nurse's station where Mercer had stood 6 months earlier, gesturing toward Megan with contempt, calling her incompetent, questioning her credentials in front of the staff. He passed that same station now in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents, his physician's badge already surrendered, his future already written in the files they carried. Nobody watched. Everybody watched. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm as though the universe was still turning normally, as though the earth hadn't just shifted beneath everyone's feet. The Washington State Medical Board moved faster than anyone expected. Within 3 weeks, Mercer's hospital privileges were revoked. His medical license was suspended pending the criminal trial outcome. His attorney negotiated a plea deal. He was sentenced to 32 months in federal prison for fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of justice. The private investigator he'd hired testified against him in exchange for immunity, detailing not just the campaign against Megan but 18 months of Mercer paying for illegal background checks on other nurses and residents, a systematic pattern of behavior that reached back years before Megan ever arrived at Seattle General. 2 former nurses came forward. One had left medicine entirely. The other had attempted suicide after Mercer's campaign forced her resignation. She sat in the courtroom during his trial and watched him accept responsibility, watched him understand finally that his power had been an illusion all along, built on fraud and maintained through fear. 6 months later, Megan stood in a Pentagon auditorium wearing her Navy dress blues for the first time since leaving active duty. The dress uniform fit her like remembered skin. Her insignia was arranged perfectly. The unit patch was still there, sewn inside her jacket lining in black and gold, soft from 18 years of touching. Major Hensley pinned the silver star to her chest. The original citation. Operation Copper Dagger, partially declassified, finally public. His hands were steady. He leaned close enough that only she could hear and whispered words that made her eyes close for a single moment. The auditorium erupted. Soldiers she'd saved stood. The Marine whose chest she'd held open during the mortar attack stood with a wife and 2 daughters who looked at Megan like she'd built their family from nothing, because she had. The staff sergeant from Seattle General who'd recognized her technique in that first chest tube insertion stood and clapped until his hands ached. The hospital's CEO was there, seated with official representation, and afterward he found her and offered her the head of trauma surgery position. Megan declined with characteristic quietness. She returned to the ICU floor as a nurse practitioner with specialized trauma certification, teaching the 3-point anchor technique to residents who hung on her every word. The technique that Mercer had mocked became the standard she taught. The shortcuts he'd accused her of became the innovations residents studied. On her first shift back at Seattle General, a young nurse asked her how she stayed so calm during codes. Megan considered the question for a long moment, her hand sorting through emergency equipment with the precise movements of someone who'd done it in darkness, under fire, with stakes that no civilian emergency could ever match. She looked at the young nurse and said, "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most." The night continued around them. Monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Somewhere in Spokane, Dr. Mercer loaded medical supplies into a van, his medical license revoked, his name appearing on professional conduct websites as a cautionary tale about physician abuse and misconduct. His wife had filed for divorce. His daughter had changed her last name. The world had moved on without him while Megan O'Brien saved another life with the same quiet competence that had once made a threatened man desperate enough to commit federal crimes trying to destroy her. She kept the unit patch in her jacket lining. Black and gold. Worn soft from years of touching. A reminder that you don't need an audience to do the right thing. You just need steady hands and the courage to act. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please like this video and subscribe. Comment below, what would you have done in Megan's position? Would you have let the truth come out, or would fear have silenced you? Let me know. Thanks for watching.